Welcome to the Westport Library. Today's program will begin momentarily. Supported by Verso Studios, created locally and shared with the world.
Good evening. Thank you all for coming. My name is Jeff Manchester, and I was a childhood friend of David Grann, who also grew up here in Westport. David Grann is the author of the #1 New York Times bestsellers, Killers of the Flower Moon and The Lost City of Z. Killers of the Flower Moon was a finalist for the National Book Award and won an Edgar Allan Poe Award. He is also the author of The White Darkness and the collection The Devil and Sherlock Holmes. Grann's investigative reporting has garnered several honors, including a George Pollock Award. He lives with wife and children in New York. Those are the official remarks from the publisher. We're all here to hear David talk about The Wager. Plus, you're here for an extra special treat of Zach, his son, who you'll both see and hear a performance at the end of the show about the lost souls of The Wager. I've known David, like many of you, for many, many years. And growing up in Westport, we started our friendship in the 3rd grade at the Saugatuck Elementary, where we lived in Saugatuck Shores. And there's lots of stories of shipwrecks and adventure, perhaps, as you'll hear about. I will not tell any of those stories because he's speaking after me. And as any of you know or have read, he does a great job of telling fact and embellishing with some fiction. So I don't want to set myself up for any appropriate or inappropriate stories. So without further ado, here is the star of the show, David Grann.
It's so great to be back here. Thank you, Jeff, for that lovely introduction. It's been a while since I've seen some of you. I had a lot more here probably when I saw you last, and it was a much smaller library over there when I used to live here. But it really is a pleasure to be here and talk to you a little bit about my newest project, The Wager. Research can lead you to places you never expect. For example, one day, several years ago, I found myself on a small wood-heated boat off the Chilean coast of Patagonia, heading towards a gulf that was known as the Gulf of Sorrows, or as some preferred to call it, the Gulf of Pain. And it was a storm, and the boat was shaking and rattling. Whoops, we just need to switch this over so I can show you my images. There we go, good. And the boat was shaking every which way. All I could see in front of me was a mountain of water and another mountain of water behind us. And if I stood, you couldn't stand. You just had to sit on the deck in the cabin of this little ship while we were rocking. And if you stood, you might break a limb. And as you can probably tell, I'm not much of an adventurer. And I had taken just about every medicine to stave off seasickness. I was kind of like one of those little laboratory rats. I had the little thing, and I grew up on the water, so I was used to the water, but these seas were different. And I had a little patch behind my ear, and I had this thing around my wrist, and I was about half drunk on Dramamine. And hopefully, whoops, did we lose our photographs here? Oh, I don't know. Did it go to sleep?
Yeah.
What do I do?
That's a good question. I actually don't. Hold on one second.
Okay. I'll keep talking, and then when we get it. I did, bring with me, and hopefully if we can get this working again, to disprove my friend Jeff's claim that I embellish, I had actually brought some video proof of that trip. which hopefully we'll be able to show in a moment. And, you know, as I basically just sat on that floor with the boat shaking.
Keep going.
Keep going, all right.
Yep.
As objects were flying past me, I began to feel a bit queasy, and I kept looking out one of the little portholes of the boat, hoping, here we go, perfect. So, here is our proof. So you could just kind of imagine me hunkered down there, all my seasick medicine hanging on. And I kept looking through one of those little portholes, hoping to catch a glimpse of this place that for so long had consumed my imagination, Wager Island. On that place, long time ago, on that deserted island, had unfolded one of the most extraordinary and gripping sagas I'd ever heard of. One that had influenced philosophers like Voltaire and Rousseau, scientists like Charles Darwin, and two of the great novelists of the sea, Herman Melville and Patrick O'Brian. The story also felt in many ways like a parable for our own turbulent times. Yet as the boat rolled further and further over and the seas consumed us, I began to wonder what perhaps you're all wondering now, which is, what the hell was I doing in the Gulf of Pain? Now, this story, believe it or not, begins back in 1742. It was then that a small battered boat had washed ashore off the coast of Brazil. And on board were 30 men, their bodies wasted to the bone. And one of them rose with an extraordinary exertion of will and announced that they were the survivors of His Majesty's ship, the Wager, and that they had been shipwrecked on a desolate island off the Chilean coast of Patagonia. And after building this flimsy craft, they had traversed some 3,000 miles, completing one of the longest castaway voyages ever recorded. And they were hailed for their ingenuity and for their bravery. But then, a few months later, another boat washed ashore. This one was even smaller. It was just a little wooden dugout. It had a sail that was stitched together from blankets, and on board were 3 additional survivors whose condition was even worse.
Keep going.
Okay.
Yep, don't mind me.
Whose condition was even worse. One of them was so delirious, he could barely recollect his name. Yet after they recovered, they told a very different story, that those people who had gone to Brazil before them were not heroes. They were mutineers. And in the controversy that ensued with these charges being lobbied back and forth between both groups, it became clear that while stranded on that desolate island, they had slowly descended into a real-life Lord of the Flies with warring factions and mutiny and murder. Back in England, the leaders of the different factions, along with their principal allies, were summoned to face a court-martial. And the writer Joan Didion famously said, "We all tell ourselves stories in order to live." But in their case, it was quite literally true, because if they failed to tell a convincing tale, they could be hanged after everything they'd been through. And they began to wage this furious war over the truth. Now, they had once hoped to return to England, bathed in glory and filled with riches. After an imperial war had broken out between Great Britain and Spain, its rival, in 1739, the men of the Wager had received orders to set off with a squadron of warships on a secret mission to try to capture a Spanish galleon that was filled with so much treasure. It was known as the prize of all the oceans. And believe it or not, that was part of the military mission. It had a real whiff of piracy about it. And in fact, each of the seamen were offered a tantalizing prospect, a share of the treasure. But first, they had to get out of the dockyards in England, which was proving an insurmountable task. These ships were really the engineering marvels of their time. They were designed to both be most murderous instruments for battle, but also the homes where hundreds of seamen would live together as a family in close quarters for years at a time. The Wager, launched from that dockyard, and here you can see a precise model of it, was 123 feet long. It had 3 masts. It could fly about a dozen sails. The larger warships in the expedition, the Wager was the smallest one, could fly as many as 18 sails at a time. Yet as sophisticated as these ships were, they were also very vulnerable to the elements because they were made of very perishable materials, primarily wood. It could take as much as 4,000 trees to build a single one of these warships. And so they would be burrowed with little sea worms would burrow into the hulls, termites would eat at them, rats would gnaw. And so they were trapped at these dockyard, whoops. I need you back. I swear I'm not doing anything. Just standing, I'm trying not to move. So they were trapped at this dockyard waiting to be repaired and fitted out. Partly because they were going to be on a voyage for so long, they also needed countless tons of provisions. On a single one of these warships, it would require as much as 40 miles of rope, 15,000 square feet of sail, and a farm's worth of animals, including cattle and pigs and goats, none of which were very cooperative in boarding these ships. But most of all, they needed men, skilled men to work these ships. But back then, Great Britain did not have conscription and it had exhausted its supply of volunteers. And so, desperate for men, they needed about 2,000 to man all the ships in the squadron. They sent out the press gangs. And these gangs would roam around towns and cities and ports. And they would eyeball you to see if you had any of the telltale signs of a mariner. And if you had a round hat, like a seaman, or if you had even a little bit of tar under your fingernails, because tar was used on ships to make everything water resistant, they would seize you and in effect kidnap you and take you unwillingly on this perilous expedition. But even then, the squadron was short of men, so the Admiralty took the extreme measure of rounding up men from a retirement home, seamen and soldiers, many of whom were in their 60s and 70s, who were missing an assortment of limbs. Some were so sick they had to be hoisted on stretchers onto this voyage. Now, one of the things that really fascinated me about these ships is that they were like a floating civilization. And you had strangers, some as young as 6 years old. There were boys who were 6 or 7 training to be seamen. And you had men in their 80s. The cook on the Wager was in his 80s. And they were all thrown together, and they came from all walks of life. You would have aristocrats, who would be the officers and dandies. You had city paupers. You had free black seamen. You had professional craftsmen. And the Great Britain and the Navy had a pretty good reputation of molding all these kind of fractious individuals into what Vice Admiral Nelson later would dub a band of brothers. Yet the challenge, especially on the Wager, was enormous because so many of the men had been pressed unwillingly and so many of them were sick. And after nearly a year of being marooned at the dockyards, the ships were ready finally to set sail, and they embarked on this voyage. And this sketch is really interesting because it was done from somebody who was on one of the ships. So that's exactly, he portrays it as he saw it. You could see the Wager, the largest ship kind of off to one side with the flag. That was the flagship, the Centurion, where the Commodore of the expedition, George Anson, was on. And I tell the story is structured in an unusual way because this really was a war over the truth. And so I tell the story from the warring perspective of three members of the Wager. And I do this to try to show how we all rummage through our memories, selecting and burnishing and highlighting, fashioning stories to try to emerge as the heroes of our own stories, to live with the things that we have done or haven't done. And one of the perspectives I tell a story from was David Cheap. And David Cheap was an interesting figure. He becomes the captain of the Wager. He was somebody who back on land, he was from Scotland, was always kind of embittered and frustrated, plagued by debts and chased by creditors, but he always found refuge on a warship and kind of enjoyed the fellowship of his fellow seamen. And on this voyage, he had finally obtained what he had always corrosively longed for, which was he had become a captain of his own warship and had a chance to capture his own lucrative prize. And the second perspective I tell the book from, I don't have a picture to show you because we don't know what he looks like. He did not come from the aristocracy or the well-to-do. He could not afford to have one of these portraits of an officer that were often made. He came from the lower to middle class, but we know what he thought because he was very literate. He was a compulsive diarist. He was, in many ways, the most skilled seaman on the Wager. His name was John Bulkley, and he was the gunner. And he was an instinctive leader, yet because he did not come from the aristocracy, he knew that in those days of rigid class structure, he would never become a commander of his own warship. And then the third perspective is told from that of John Byron, who had been a 16-year-old midshipman on the Wager when it set sail. And if the name sounds familiar, he would later go on to become the grandfather of the poet Lord Byron, whose poetry, including Don Juan, was greatly influenced by what he referred to as my granddad's narrative. And unlike many of the men on the Wager, John Byron was not pressed. He had volunteered. This is a story not only about the stories we tell, but also the way stories shape us. And he had been greatly influenced by the romantic tales of seamen and thought he would embark on this romantic voyage. And in many ways, he serves as our eyes and ears on this bewildering world as he's training to become an officer. He has to learn all the secret coded language of a ship. And it wasn't until researching this book that I discovered how much of the phrases we use today actually derive from the age of sail. For example, the word scuttlebutt. Scuttlebutt was a barrel on a ship that was filled with water where the seamen would gather around for their water rations. And what would they do? They would gossip. Pipe down was the boatswain's whistle to be quiet at night or before a battle. Piping hot was the boatswain's whistle for a hot meal. Under the weather. I always thought under the weather was just kind of a perfect metaphor for sickness, but it turns out it was actually quite literal. That when you were a seaman on the ship and you were sick, you did not serve on watch. You were not on deck. You were kept below, so you were quite literally under the weather. And perhaps my favorite of those phrases from back then, it came a little bit later in the century, was to turn a blind eye. And that derived from when Horatio Nelson was in a battle and he wanted to ignore his senior officer's signal flag to retreat. And he had a blind eye, so he took his telescope and he put it up to his blind eye so he wouldn't see the flag. And that's why we say today, to turn a blind eye. And at one point, John Byron receives the order that every young midshipman would receive on a ship, which was, go aloft. And that meant he had to climb one of these masts that would rise about 100 feet into the air, scurrying along these ropes. A plunge from such a height would kill you. And as he got to the top, he could look out in the distance and he could see the other ships in the squadron. And then beyond him, he could see the open sea on which he hoped to finally write his own romantic tale. But soon, everything began to go wrong. As they're crossing the Atlantic, they're chased by a Spanish armada, which was even more powerful than the British squadron. And then they have to head around Cape Horn at the tip of South America. I always knew that this was an area of really rough seas, but I had never really understood why. And it's because it's the one place on the globe where the seas travel uninterrupted, unimpeded by land, completely around the globe, traveling some 13,000 miles, accumulating power, until they funnel into this passageway between the tip of South America and Antarctica. And you have the strongest currents there on Earth. You have the Cape Horn roller waves that can dwarf a 90-foot mast. And then you have the winds, which can accelerate to hurricane force and even reach 200 miles per hour. Herman Melville, who later rounded the Horn, joining that very rarefied elite club, compared it to a descent into hell in Dante's Inferno. And at that moment, the seamen and the ships were just being battered and bandied about as if they were no more than pitiful rowboats. All the sails were blowing out. At one point, one of the captains of one of the ships couldn't operate the vessels because they had no sails. And so he orders his men to climb the mast and to hold on to the ropes, the shrouds, and the ratlines, and use their bodies as threadbare sails as they hold on into a gale. Meanwhile, the ship is rocking about 45 degrees to one side and 45 degrees to the other. And the captains and the officers and the other men all knew that if they were going to have any chance to persevere in these tempests, they would need everybody on board. But it was in that very time period where many of the men could no longer rise from their hammocks, suffering from a mysterious illness. Their teeth began to fall out. Their hair fell out. Even the cartilage that seemed to hold together their bones seemed to be coming undone. There was one seaman who had fractured a bone 5 decades earlier in a battle, and that bone had long since healed, and suddenly, mysteriously and inexplicably, it shattered in the same place. And the disease was also affecting their senses. One seaman said, "The disease got into our brains and we went raving mad." And they were suffering from that great enigma of the age of sail, which was scurvy. Nobody then knew what caused it. They didn't know that it was from a deficiency of vitamin C, and that the cure was so simple. They just needed more fruits and vegetables in their diets. Of course, the British Navy, decades later, when it realized that vitamin C would cure scurvy, gave limes on board ships, which is why British seamen became known as limeys. But they didn't know that back then. And quite tragically, before they had rounded the Horn, they had stopped on an island off Brazil where there were all these limes. And as they're coming around the Horn, they are suffering from one of the worst maritime outbreaks of scurvy ever recorded in maritime history. Hundreds and hundreds of seamen on all the ships perished, their bodies tossed unceremoniously into the sea. As the poet Lord Byron would later put it, without a grave, unknown, unknelled, and uncoffined. And the ships are trying desperately, the men on the ships, to keep the ships close together because they know if they separate, there'll be nobody there to rescue them if they're all alone. And so they're constantly firing their guns to signal their location because they didn't have other means of communication. So they're firing blanks from their cannons. But eventually, the winds drown out the sounds, and all the ships scatter in the storm, and the Wager is left alone and to its own destiny. And Captain Cheap is determined to prove his mettle, to prove himself as a commander. in his new position, and he manages to steer them around Cape Horn, and he's hoping to reach a rendezvous point off the coast of Chile that Commodore Anson had given them in case they ever separated. Yet, even though he gets them around the Horn and they're coming up the coastline, they are sailing, like all seamen back then, partially blind. And why is that? Because they could determine their latitude rather easily by reading the stars, as seamen had done from ages, but they had no way of knowing their longitude because they did not have reliable clocks to measure it. And so they have to rely on what was known as dead reckoning, which was essentially a leap of faith and guesswork, informed guesswork. There is a reason why it was called dead reckoning. And the men on the wager realize that they have not only miscalculated their longitude, but they have done so by hundreds of miles. And suddenly they find themselves in what is now known as the Gulf of Sorrows or the Gulf of Pain, barreling towards land. And they hit a submerged rock. And you have to understand that these ships were their homes, their fortresses, and many seamen, most seamen back then, did actually not know how to swim. And suddenly the rudder shatters, and a 2-ton anchor falls, plunges through the hull, the bottom of the hull, leaving a gaping hole. And then another wave comes and washes the wager off these rocks. So suddenly it is careening through this mine full of rocks in this gulf, without a rudder to steer by, and with water pouring into it through the hole, until at last it crashes into a cluster of rocks, and it begins to break apart at last. The planks begin to shatter, the decks cave in, the masts come down, water is surging upward through the bottom of the hull, rats are scurrying upward. Those seamen who have been suffering from scurvy, who were too sick to get out of their hammocks, drowned. Yet the ship did not sink, at least yet, because it became wedged between two pillars of rocks. And the survivors kind of scurried up onto the remnants of the ship, and when they peered out into the distance, that's when they glimpsed this desolate island. And of course, that's where the real hell began. It was about 146 of them who had survived. There had originally been about 250 members of the company. And about 146, including Captain Cheap, including the young midshipman, the boy, John Byron, and the gunner, John Bulkley, managed to get ashore using a small transport boat. And they hope that maybe this will be their salvation. But the island turns out to be barren and windy and cold. The temperature hovers around freezing, and it's constantly raining or sleeting. And worst of all, they can find virtually no food. They find some seaweed, which they eat in their desperation. There are some clams along the coast, but they gradually exhaust that supply. They do find some sprouts of celery. And this, mysteriously to them, but somewhat miraculously, does cure their scurvy because it had some vitamin C in it. One British officer compared the island to a place where the soul of man dies in him. And I know a lot of you have probably not read the book, so I won't spoil the unfathomable saga that unfolded on that island. But what is so interesting is that that island became akin to a laboratory to test the human condition under very extreme circumstances. And slowly, inevitably, it begins to reveal each of their hidden nature, both the good and the bad. And even while they are starving, they try to build an encampment. Captain Cheap is determined to govern by the same rules that had existed on the ship and to build this kind of imperial outpost. He believes he should be the captain because he had been the captain of their ship. And even in that state of starvation, they hold these deep philosophical debates about the nature of leadership, loyalty, duty, patriotism, and finally that taboo of mutiny. And the question would arise, should Captain Cheap remain their leader because he had been the leader on the ship and that was his title? Or in that democracy of suffering, could somebody like John Bulkley, that instinctive leader, even though he was not from the aristocracy, emerge as a commander in his own right? At one point, they are visited by several native Patagonians who arrive on a couple canoes, and they were the Carasquar people. The Carasquar had occupied and lived in this region along the coastline of Chile and Patagonia, going back hundreds and hundreds of years. They had, over time, adapted to this very harsh and seemingly inhospitable environment. They tended to travel in kind of small familial groups. They lived almost exclusively off marine resources, and they spent much of their time in canoes. They had adapted so well that NASA, centuries later, would study the Carasquar before putting humans into space to try to see if they could gather clues about how they had survived. And one of the things they would always do to keep warm is they always kept fires going, even in their canoes. And they knew all the hidden locations along the coastline where they could find seafood. And they offer the castaways a lifeline. And yet this is also a story about imperialism and racism, and this notion that the British had that their civilization was somehow superior to others. And many of them mistreat the castaways, and the castaways are looking the Carasquar are looking at these kind of hairy, pale castaways spiraling into violence, and eventually, as Byron documents in his account, they just disappear. They just leave them. And at that point, the castaways only descend further into a state of Hobbesian depravity. There is violence, there is murder, there are warring factions, there's cannibalism. Now, eventually, several members of these factions do make it back to England. And I won't get into their sagas, but they are extraordinary, each of them in their own right. You know, imagine all that they had been through. You know, scurvy, typhoon, shipwreck, starvation. They then set off in different groups, but one of them, you know, in a castaway, packed so tightly they can barely even stand, traveling thousands of miles. These journeys rival and echo, for example, Shackleton's famous journey. And incredibly, they do get back to England, some of them. And as they had feared, they are summoned to this military tribunal where they are to be tried for their alleged crimes on the island. And so, after waging this very brutal war over the elements, they begin to wage this war over the truth. And this was happening at a time, I would go to the archives where you can find these documents from the 18th century that survived shipwreck and went around the world. And I'd be reading about misinformation and disinformation and allegations of so-called fake journals. And then I would come home and I would read the paper, and what would I hear? Alternative facts and fake news. And then I would go back to the archives and I'd be reading about this war over history. There was a great battle over history. Who would get to tell this story? Whose story would prevail? And of course, the British Empire was looking at all these stories wondering, do we really like any of them? They make us look more like brutes than like gentlemen. So just as the story shows how people often shape their stories to serve their self-interests, so do empires, so do nations. Now, just a quick word about the process of researching this. I did begin it in a way that was suited to my very paltry physical attributes, which is in the archives in England. And you can find all these records that still exist, log books. I mean, it's just kind of amazing. They're water stained. When you open them, you just breathe in a cloud of dust. It takes a while to learn to read these books. I always say documents can speak to you in unexpected ways. One of the records I pulled were muster books. And muster books at first seemed to me like very uninteresting documents. They were simply an enrollment of when members came on a ship, their name would be written down and their rank and when they arrived. But I had noticed there were these little symbols next to many of the names. And at first I had no idea what they meant, but I kept seeing the letters DD, 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 and I had no idea what that was. And then eventually I learned that that meant discharged dead, and that this was effectively their epitaphs from the journey, that so many of them had died on the voyage. And I realized that this seemingly kind of anodyne document really contained these clues to the horrific toll that this voyage had taken. Nearly 2,000 men had gone and more than 1,300 had perished. But after about 2 years of doing this research, I began to be gnawed by that little doubt. How could I really know what the castaways had been through unless I went to Wager Island? And so that's why I decided to make this rather foolish trip. I don't describe it in the book. For those of you who read it, you know that. But I don't describe my own trip. But it was so important to breathe life into so many of the descriptions. Initially, I had found a captain on Chiloé Island who had a boat who was willing to take me the 350 miles south from Chiloé Island off the coast of Chile to what is now known as Wager Island. And he had initially sent me a photograph of the boat, and it looked really big in the photograph. And I thought it was great. It's like Jacques Cousteau, I've got this. And then it took me many days to get to Chiloé Island, multiple plane rides, cars, ferries. But eventually I got there and I took one look at the boat, and I was like, oh, that's not the boat that looked like in the photograph. It was this small wood-heated vessel. This was my glorious cabin, and they gave me the best cabin on the ship. It was so tempestuous, the weather, that we couldn't set off. We were supposed to leave right away, but the Coast Guard had closed the port because of the storms. And so we spent one day just trapped on the boat, and another day and another day. 4 days went by, and I began to fear we would never get off. But finally, the Coast Guard allowed us to get off. We slipped out at dawn. We went across this gulf that was very rough, but then we entered the channels. And I know some of you have probably been to Patagonia, but the coastline has all these little islets. And if you kind of weave behind and around between these islets, you're actually very sheltered from the sea. And so it was very chillingly beautiful. We didn't see after a day or so, another vessel or person for days at a time. We would stop the vessel on some of the islands and chop down wood to heat the boat. I'd gone at winter time so I could have a sense of what it was like when the castaways were there. We would bring the wood onto the boat. We would also hook a stream, that's our captain, a little hose up to the glacial streams to get water for the vessel. I assure you it was the coldest shower I had ever taken. 1 second, and basically that was enough for you. And then after about 5 days of my confidence growing, that's when the captain came to me and said, well, if we're gonna get to Wager Island, I think now we're gonna have to go out into the ocean to get there. And so that's when we headed out into these seas, and I got my first glimpse of them. And just for a quick memory reminder, here I was on this little vessel. I'm not the smartest bulb, and so I was figuring out how I could pass the time, and I happened to have a recording of Moby Dick on my iPhone, and I listened to that as I was bouncing around in these seas, which in hindsight was not the most soothing thing to have done. But my captain was very skilled, and he managed to lead us across the sea and then eventually into the Gulf of Pain. And he pointed to several islands that we were going past. Their names were Waller Island, and Smith Island, and Hobbs Island. And they had these very kind of curiously British-sounding names. And I realized that these were the names of castaways from the Wager who had been abandoned on these group of islands. When one of their castaway boats sank, they didn't have space for them on the other boat. And so this was their epitaph. Of course, modern seamen, including my captain, had no idea why those islands were named that. And we went by a Byron Island and a cheap canal. And eventually we did arrive at Wager Island, and it remains a place of wild desolation. The trees are still bent, always bent at 45-degree angles, almost lying on top of each other. I include this next photograph because it makes me look so handsome. But I do it just to show you how cold I was. And it was only in making this trip, I had all these layers on me, but it's a wind and it's a cold, it's a wet cold, because it's always raining or sleeting. And I realized only then that, oh, when they were always saying in their journals they were freezing, of course they were suffering from hypothermia. It had not even occurred to me. And when I went to the island, sure enough, there was virtually no food. I did see some of the celery that they had eaten, which I tasted, but that was really about it. And it was only after making that trip that I could understand why that British officer had described the island as a place where the soul of man dies in him. And at one point when we were there, somebody in my group pointed to a little icy stream, and there were several planks of wood floating in that stream. They were about 5 yards long, and they were bound together by these wooden pegs. And they are the remnants of an 18th century ship believed to be from His Majesty's ship, the Wager. And I knew what they were. We knew what they were because a joint British-Chilean expedition had discovered them about a decade earlier. And here you can see what they look like. And I took this video of them. And I was just astonished staring at them because that's all that remains of that ferocious struggle that had once taken place there, or of all the ravaging dreams of empire. And I would spend years documenting the sound and the fury. And yet as I stood there, the only sound I could hear was the eternal hush of the sea. Be happy to answer any questions you have.
If the audience has any questions, please come to this microphone so that everyone can hear what you're asking.
Hi, fascinating talk. Thanks. How many people made it to England?
Yeah, there were about 30 or so made it back. What was crazy, it's kind of like a Victorian novel where people just periodically, stragglers will show up. Some arrived 6 years after they had set sail from England. Their families had obviously long since presumed they're dead. I describe one of them arriving at his home. Well, he doesn't even know, he can't even find the house where his family lives anymore. And then when he finally tracks down his sister, she can't even recognize him.
You spent so much time reading the journals of these seamen. Do you think that your writing style was infected by theirs?
That's a really good question. You know, you read all these accounts, and a lot of these early logbooks kind of became the seeds of sea literature as we know it. You know, these logbooks would influence, for example, a book was written around that time, like Robinson Crusoe, which is actually based on a true story that was mentioned in a logbook. And so you see the influence on these tales on sea literature. So in that sense, they had a certain influence, and but you are trying to modernize it in terms of the prose so that it resonates today and that you're kind of eliciting the themes. But you're no question influenced by it because they are all sea yarns, and in a way you are spinning your own sea yarn based on their accounts.
Thanks, David, for this account. It's clear from all your projects there's a lot of research that goes into it. How do you manage the volume of research, but also not losing your storytelling voice? And how do you merge these things together into a whole in these projects?
Yeah, so it is a challenge because I don't, take liberties. So I want it to read like a novel, but it needs to all be true. It needs to be all derived from the facts and the documents. So there is an enormous amount of research to be able to write these vivid scenes, to describe what it's like when you're climbing a mast in a gale, what's it like when the ship is rocking, what is it like when your body is coming undone and you're losing your mind from scurvy. So you want to track down all these journals and read all these logbooks. Often reading the logbooks could take months and months because you're reading them with a magnifying glass, the faded prose. And you try to then accumulate all that information and kind of create a digital library, your own kind of digital archive with all the relevant information. But then it is so important to shape the story, because I don't want to write just a kind of broad tapestry of history or a newspaper article. I want this to be a narrative that is so that you as a reader, or I as a writer, get to experience history as it is unfolding by the people who experience it. And so one of the things you need to do is you have to figure out, well, okay, how am I gonna tell this story? And so one of the things I decided that to tell it in these three kind of competing perspectives, which helped illuminate the central theme about the nature of truth, how we shape stories and tell stories. But it also allows you to kind of shape the material, because you're kind of seeing things through their individual perspectives. And I think it is always important in telling these stories to not have the arrogance of a detective looking back now that you have all the power of hindsight and know all the answers, because that is not how any of us live. We do not know what each day will bring or what will happen. And certainly when you're on an expedition and a voyage, they don't know if they're even gonna live or die from a day to day. So you're trying to experience history and seeing it and feeling it as they are. And that creates an element of suspense and intrigue. And just to kind of finally answer your questions, you tend to write things a bit longer, because I will geek out and I will spend months learning how to build one of these ships. And every little, like, how do they make the ropes, and how do they get the cattle on board? And I'll write it too long, and I'll then give my chapter to my wife, Kira, and I have what I call the God No file. And the God No file is when she reads it and I hear her mutter to herself, "Oh God, no." And that's where I've gone on a tangent about shipbuilding way too long that no normal human being can sustain or withstand. And so those parts go into the God No file. And so you're always honing your manuscript up until the very end, distilling it to the most important details and the most important vivid scenes that highlight the story and reveal it, and not bogging it down. Just because it spent you 3 years finding out a fact doesn't mean it should go in the book. Although I wish it did.
And that feeds into my question. Thank you. The angel of the book for me was the detail. For example, Anson figures out that his broadside cannons could traverse farther than the galleons, meaning he could head up into the wind or off or whatever, but not present the broadside.
Yes, yes.
And the book is packed with that kind of fabulous detail, which is the reason why I'm also in love with Patrick O'Brien.
Oh, yes.
But where did you get that nugget? And I'm very curious about the process, and I'm curious about how you found this story in the first place, because it's an obscure.
Yeah, it's very forgotten now. Yeah.
Story.
So to your first question is, I mean, what was amazing is, on every ship you were required to, the officers, the top officers, the captain were required to keep a logbook, the lieutenant. So you would have their almost day-by-day accounts. And then on each of these ships, you often had writers, scribblers. And there was also a growing market for these books back home. There was growing literacy, and there was a growing appetite for these stories. So you had various scribblers maybe hoping maybe their account might be read, or sometimes they were just privately, like a John Bulkley, keeping their journal. And so, for example, during that sea battle, I had multiple accounts of people on board the ship, and they had very vivid accounts of the battle, including one of them describing how Anson positioned the ship in such a way that it was less vulnerable to the cannon fires. Ships in those days tended to go to battle, well, it's not but they tended to go to battle like broadside, side by side. It was almost like floating platforms where you would just face off and you would just bang your cannons right at each other. And the most dangerous thing, which I didn't know until I did the research, wasn't actually the cannonballs. I mean, they were dangerous, but was actually splinters. Most of the seamen would die because the cannonballs would just ricochet across the ship and just ripping apart the wood, and you'd have these 2-foot to foot-long spears just flying in every direction. So before a battle, they'd be unloading on any unnecessary wood. Another detail you find in these accounts was they would toss the cattle overboard so they wouldn't be in the way. So you just imagine these screaming cattle plunging into the sea before battle. But Anson very cleverly realized that the cannons on the Spanish ship, the gun ports were narrow, so the cannons couldn't be pivoted. So he positioned the ship in such a way, kind of cutting it off in front of him a little bit, closer to a perpendicular angle. And because of that, as he was describing, it's able to avoid a lot of the direct hits and unleash its direct hits into the Spanish ship. I think, was that both questions? I can't remember what the other question was. Oh, yes, how did I find the story? I came across the story, I was doing research on mutinies, and I happened to come across in a digital version, a digital scan copy from an archive in England. It was online at the time, and I was doing this research on mutinies, and it turned out to be the account by John Byron, the grandfather of the poet Lord Byron, and it was this, he'd just been a boy at the time. And I will say that, when you come across a story like this, now it all makes sense, that I would tell the story. But when you're first reading, you're like, wow, it's kind of written in this old, tangled English. The S's were printed as F's. So you're kind of like, what is this? I never expected to tell a story from the 18th century, and I know nothing about that period. And yet I kept pausing over these remarkable descriptions. He described the tempests around Cape Horn as the perfect hurricane, just a kind of a perfect phrase. And he described cannibalism, but he didn't like to use the word cannibalism, so he referred to it as that last extremity. And so I realized that story, really had the clues or the first hints of one of the more extraordinary sagas of survival and resilience and also mayhem that I'd ever come across. But of course, it was still many, many more months of research before I committed to it as a book, trying to figure out the other dimensions of the story.
That's great. That ties into my question, which is, when you're coming up with story ideas, do you ever end up having these stories from the past or contemporary that interest you, but they just don't lead to a story? And if so, what is it that makes a story that can become a book?
Yeah, that happens a lot. I mean, I try to be fairly ruthless about my preliminary investigation of a story idea so that I won't wake up 2 years in a project and know I'm going down like the wager. Time and investment, and there's no turning back. If you're going to turn back early on. And so, you kind of come across an idea and you apply a certain kind of analytical rigor to it. Is it gripping? Does it have these kind of figures? Is there something fascinating about the story? Some curiosity that kind of piques you fast? Does it have these kind of gripping elements? And so you kind of check that off. Then you have to figure out, well, is there underlying materials or is there a way to tell it? Because often there isn't. I've come across great spy stories, and then I ask the CIA to release their files, and they say, yeah, good luck with that. You can wait another 100 years before they'll be declassified, so there's no way to tell that story. So a lot of stories like that have to go. And then if you're going to spin a book, write a book, these things take me about half a decade. You need to have those other themes. So for The Wager, I was like, check, gripping, check. I found all these underlying materials. Check, wow, it's really got all these themes about really modern themes about the nature of truth, the way we still tell stories. There was something timeless about the story. The way we fight over the truth, the way we shape our stories and manipulate our stories, and the way nations and empires tell stories. We are in a period where we have our own battles over history and what stories we will highlight or leave out and how we want to tell our histories. So when I saw that, I said, okay, check. It had all these kind of rich possibilities, and you don't know what yet. I mean, you're just embarking. You'll find out all these other things along the way, other themes and other dimensions you don't expect. But that's kind of what you go through. But I will say, ultimately, there's also an irrational quality. And in some ways, that's probably the most important quality, which is you apply this rational rigor to say, okay, is this project interesting? But at some level, it's kind of irrational that you leave a story and you're looking at other things, and yet that story keeps drawing you back. For some reason, that story has got its hooks into you. And if you're going to tell one of these stories, you do need to have some level of obsession. Because if you don't have that, you're not going to tell it well, and you're not going to make it to the end of the voyage.
Mr. Grann, I understand that you also brought a little special surprise for us this evening.
Yes. Yes, yeah. So there are many reasons why I wrote this book, but you're gonna hear the best reason why this book was written, although I didn't know it at the time. My son, Zachary, is gonna come up and play a song which he'll introduce, and I think you'll see why you're hearing it. And you get to hear the real talent in the family.
I thank you to the Westport Library and to Jeff and, of course, to my dad. When I was asked by my mom jokingly to write a song about the book for the book party, I said no. I was busy at the time, so yeah, I said no. And then I started reading the book, and how could I not write a song about it? So this is Lost Souls of Wager Island. They came to the island like hungry runaways, huddled by the ocean under cold slashing rain. Faint and almost helpless, the clad bunch looked for shelter, while some dressed like a lord paramount prepared for immaculate adventure. Comes and goes, the sun is getting low, and they know they're alone in this world, in this world, in this world, in this world. The dark don't hide anything. The soul of a man dies in him. Look out, the ships are coming in. Lost souls of Wager Island. The party blamed the captain for things he hadn't done. The captain told his men about the captain he still was, but nobody listened to what he was saying. When they left him on the beach, they must have seen the beast in him. Comes and goes, the sun is getting low, and they know they're alone in this world, The dark don't hide anything. The soul of a man dies in him. Oh, look out, the ships are coming in. Lost souls of Wager Island. Lost souls of Wager Island. Lost souls. Lost souls. Lost souls. Lost souls. Thank you.
Thank you, Zachary. I'd like to thank everyone here in the building. I'd like to thank David Grann for coming to share his story with us. For those of you here, we have copies of The Wager for purchase right here. If you have purchased your book online before this evening, those books are also over here. And Mr. Grann will be signing them all. So thank you all for coming out tonight and joining us here for this, and we hope to see you soon at another Westport Library event.